So I'm David Bennett, Chair for Transition Sweden, the national network that coordinates and connects local transition initiatives in Sweden. We also connect with the larger organization out in the world, in Europe and beyond. I work full-time with transition by teaching courses and doing things like this, as well as we've got a small a growing vegetable patch here in Härnösand. So enough about me. Here, this is a black hole in the news this year because of the Nobel Prize, and we could say that we are now beyond the event horizon here as a civilization, as a society. The event horizon of the black hole is, as you may well know, the point beyond which no light or matter can escape, an inescapable course. We are, I believe, on this inescapable course collectively. There's lots of things that contribute to that, but that is the starting point for this course. That we can't turn this around, but it's not hopeless because of that. This is from the IPBES Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, released last year in May. And this somewhat complex diagram, which would preferably be released in bits to aid understanding and reading, shows that everything, the indirect drivers on the left, lead to the fact that we're going beyond the planetary boundaries, leading to wide-scale ecological and climate destruction, the crises that we're talking about all the time. Mass extinction, destruction of ecosystems all over the place. So we're eroding the very basis for what our civilization is based on, according to this report. What we've got then, the indirect drivers would seem to be the mess, which is, or the parts of our society which are contributing, the original cause for what we've got now. And it's not, we're focusing a lot on climate, but what we've got is all these things here. And I don't know if they realized this when they made this diagram, how insightful it is actually, because what they've got here is they've got most of the key, or almost all of the key points of these interrelating systems which are affecting us and the planet so negatively at the moment. Behind everything is the values and behaviors which drive us. They feed into the institutions, the processes, the systems on which we base our civilization. And everything all together creates a culture. It's the culture that we're living in. The culture which is unsustainable. The reason why we have these conversations about sustainability. What is sustainable? Or why even are we talking about sustainability? It's because what we've got here at the moment on our current course is not sustainable. We talk about oil tankers and how we need to start changing course now. We talk about the Titanic and icebergs. And that's what I mean about being on the past the event horizon. That all these analogies, all these metaphors that we use, they're right, but can we change the course? I don't think we can. But I think we can build something else. So what we've got behind everything, what we've got that is these these metaphors, the oil tanker or the Titanic or the aeroplane or whatever you want to have. What we've got behind everything, the driving force, is this modern industrial culture of separation, where we see ourselves as separate from one another. We see ourselves as separate from nature. We see ourselves as masters of nature, which we can do what we like with. We can take at will. We can take nature and turn it into profit and waste products. That's kind of the economic growth that's kind of the aim of economic growth, to turn the natural planet into waste and profit. This underlying culture, the engine room, if you like, of the ship that we're on, is so ingrained in everything that I'm not sure that we can unravel things, or even if it's possible. This is from the Limits to Growth Revisited report. Limits to Growth, after 30 years, the original Limits to Growth was published in 1972, and 30 years later they revisited it. The thick lines are the observed trend, and the dotted lines are the predicted trend. So see what they predicted based on historical data. They predicted the thick lines there in the middle from 1970 to 2000. And what actually happened fitted the predictions pretty well. The predictions continue then with the dotted lines, and they're pointing at an economic collapse sometime around 2030. Based on the fact that our economy requires a healthy ecosystem that we can take and turn into profit. If we don't have an ecosystem, then we can't continue this economic growth. So it looks pretty spot on, actually, that this prediction will come true. And 2030, I don't know, maybe they didn't counter for Corona, which is devastating economies. It's devastating local economies. It's devastating national economies. Governments are spending like never before in order to get us back to how it was, get us back to business as usual. So it's looking like the limits to growth, which, if you think about it, is only logical. You can't have indefinite growth on a finite planet. It was pretty much always going to come to this. So if we come back to here, and I said that civilization is what we've got, and I'm saying that the civilization that we've built so far isn't sustainable, obviously, and that perhaps we are beyond the event horizon now. But there's one important thing missing in these boxes, these nicely separate boxes, separate from one another there, and that's cheap energy. All of this is built on cheap energy, oil, mostly. Our civilization requires a high energy return on the energy invested in order to continue. And with the desperate grab for shale oil and gas and all the other things that have been done to prolong the peak oil, we're not getting the energy returns that we need. So we're borrowing heavily in order to maintain the illusion of economic growth, which is based on cheap energy. And if you do a quick systems analysis of how all these things are interrelated, it looks something like that, probably. I mean, these systems are so interrelated. Everything feeds into everything else in such a messy, natural way, because what we've got are living systems, and we can't really map them, because then we have to define artificial limits to these systems, which is what the boxes are supposed to do. But of course, there are no boxes. All the systems feed into all the other systems. The conflicts and the epidemics at the bottom feed into the institution and governance, feed into the economics and technological development. So how then what do we do now? What do we do now? What policies can we develop? What politicians should we elect that where one person or a party or maybe a coalition have an understanding of these complex systems? Have an understanding of these complex systems so that it's relevant everywhere. Can it be relevant everywhere? Is there a one size fits all? Now, of course not. As I think we're going to be hearing later on, the conditions in different places are very, very different. So what we need then are solutions or perhaps experiments, because we're not very good with complex systems, people. We try and simplify as much as possible, and that we get then a creation of a complicated mess is what we've created when we try to simplify, when we try to understand and control. So a single top-down or multiple top-down efforts would struggle impossibly to straighten out this mess. So what we need, but that's not to say that the politicians don't have a place. Of course they do, because there are some politicians that would have us in such singularity, in such in groups that are separate from one another, even more so. That people of different races wouldn't be allowed to mix even. Homogeneity taken to extremes. What we need is to mimic living systems and increase the diversity everywhere in order to bring these systems back to life or create new systems which benefit life. So Donella Meadows and others in the 30-year update to the limits of growth, from where I got the original diagram from, talk about sustainability and how it's a new idea to people. But there are people all over the world who don't see it as a negative thing, but it's an exercise of imagining and bringing into being. So it's this imagination. What if? Rob Hopkins, one of the founders of the transition movement, his latest book is called From What Is to What If. And it's that vision, those local visions. What if we were to do it in a different way? What can we imagine together? What can we bring into being a sustainable? What can we imagine, and what can we bring into being for sustainability? And it's not a reluctant thing, but we're doing it as a sense of joy. It's a joyful adventure to explore these times. We may be beyond the event horizon, but what we have now is the greatest challenge that anyone has ever faced. And if we've seen anything about humans, is that we rise to challenges, at least we try. And what we can do with this sense of joyful adventure, where we've imagined a better world, is something that's even better than today. And that's the great possibility that we're here, and that transition is exploring. And transition is exploring this all over the world already. This is not a new thing. This is something that's already in place everywhere. This screenshot is from the transitioninitiatives.org website, where we can see there's over 1,000 initiatives registered. And of course, there's many more initiatives which aren't registered, which call themselves transition initiatives. And there's many more transition-like initiatives and projects, which don't call themselves transition, but are working for the same thing, working for local communities, local regenerative communities. 29 hubs, they're the national organizations that coordinate local initiatives around the world, where Transition Sweden is one of those. So what we need to aim for now is what Daniel Christian Wahl calls regenerative cultures, regenerative local communities, experiment with and create relevant solutions, projects, meaningful ways of living, which have a systems approach where they collaborate and lead us into abundance for everybody, which also gives us a life-giving, a salutogenic civilization. But of course, again, the civilization, we can't do the whole civilization at once. We need to do it from the parts, from the bottom up, as well as a holding movement from the top down. We do need new legislation. We need legislation to protect the forests in Sweden, for example, from clear cutting. Regenerative local communities have a lot of, so transition towns, it's an urban movement. Sweden is largely rural. And just a quick search on Facebook for the term ödehus, you can see it at the top there. That means abandoned house. All these groups got 16,000 members, 34,000 members, 24,000 members. Of course, there's going to be some repetition of people there, but it's pointing at a movement where people are seeing that cities are perhaps not as resilient as they've been hyped up as being. Maybe smart cities aren't the way forward, but it's a back to the country movement, particularly when we've now seen that remote working does work. Employers have been wary about that, but we can see with all these Zoom meetings that we spend our days in, that remote working does indeed work. So the ecological benefit of using existing resources instead of building new resources. But of course, there's a lot of projects of building new villages as well. The images in the middle there are a artist's view of a project in Östersund, northwest Sweden. A collaboration project between Jamtli and one of the Mid-Sweden University. And then the image on the right there is another eco-village. They're all pretty much the same though, and it's all based on houses. What we say in Transition Network and in another group that I'm in, the Village Academy, is that it's villages and this village mentality, it's got nothing to do with houses. It's all about the culture that you have, how you make decisions together, what you populate the village with, rather than what the energy systems are, how you recycle it, whether there's a bioreactor there or not. So one local example of people coming together with this vision of talking about local food resilience was our potato appeal that the Transition Network coordinated this year. And this is what it looked like in Härnösand, where I live. I mean, just invite people in and try and get a place to grow potatoes. This was at the regional university, not regional university, regional museum. And yeah, we just invite people in with a vision of talking about food and growing potatoes, and just in simple acts. You start collaborating, you start dreaming, and it's a joyful thing. Just doing the simple things. And of course, we need to be more radical than that, but small steps count as well. So what we need is a combination of head and heart and hands. That's the holy trinity of the transition movement, where we combine all of these things. We need to be in it intellectually, emotionally, and actively with our hands. We need to create these new regenerative cultures, these new regenerative local communities, which are our lifeboats from the civilization which has perhaps passed the event horizon. Maybe we can't turn it around, but we can build new, resilient and regenerative local communities. That's what the transition movement is all about. And that's why I spend all my time working with transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for these insights. I will give over the word to Jan Hendrik now.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to come here. Thank you for the nice talk by David. I think I was asked here to give some perspectives from international work I've done in Africa and Latin America, linked to grassroots innovations. And I've seen here in the southwest of Sweden many of the different types of activities that David was talking about. People starting up things, innovating, trying to change things for the better. And of course, in informal settlements in Kenya, you also see this driven, of course, because there's a lack of most things like food, water, sanitation, waste management, jobs, etc. And these informal settlements can be seen as sort of a nexus of global unsustainability. But lots of things are happening, lots of innovations in these informal contexts, and they are drawing on networks among relatives and neighbors for developing knowledge and funding. And they provide quite a lot of environmental and social benefits, and they can be seen as contributing to a local circular economy. And in Kenya, there's almost a total lack of capacity of municipalities and cities to deliver services to their citizens. There's no waste management, no sanitation, very few schools, health care facilities, and so on. So these municipalities, or from a transition theory perspective, you can call them the regimes. They let these innovators deliver services through different entrepreneurial or social economy activities. But they do not really acknowledge them, and instead they make it quite hard for them to do this. There's a lot of bureaucracy, permits, taxes, fees, repression, corruption, and violence. And all this leads to certain passiveness and resignation among these grassroots innovators, which sort of leads to a suppression of these innovative niches by the regime, by the municipalities, and leads to an overall very poor societal performance. In Argentina and Brazil, these are somewhat richer countries, but there's still quite a lot of lack of services in informal areas or poorer areas of cities and in the countryside. And also here you see a lot of niches of grassroots innovations and activities in these informal contexts. Here there is a certain lack of capacity to deliver services from the municipalities and cities. And also here you can see that these cities or the regimes, they let these innovators deliver services in different ways through their innovations and different ways of organizing themselves. And also here you have the problem that they are seldom acknowledged by the municipalities. And you also have these problems with repression and bureaucracy and violence and so on. But there is something that is a bit different from Kenya, because in Latin America, these groups tend to claim their rights to sort of the space in the regime through different types of political mobilizations. They form coalitions with other stakeholders, and there's a lot of resistance, activism, etc. And they are sort of influencing the cities, the state, to take on board some of these niche innovations. They gradually become part of the regime through legislation or procurement schemes or reverse logistics programs for environmental auditing, etc. And you can see that this sort of improves the societal performance, at least in parts of these societies, which is very interesting. But now coming to Sweden then, as I said, I can see quite a lot of activities sort of bottom-up activities happening in Sweden. Lots of grassroots innovations. People are engaging in different ways to improve society. But it seems to me, from this sort of a bit narrow perspective, that Sweden is more similar to Kenya than to Argentina and Brazil. You have all these grassroots innovations, but there is a clear lack of or unwillingness of the regime, of municipal public officials, etc., to acknowledge and promote these grassroots innovations and see that they contribute quite a lot to social justice or environmental improvements or circular economy for that matter. In Sweden, authorities or administrations tend to say that we the regime, we already know how to best do this. We don't have to listen to you, grassroots. You're just kind of an annoyance to us. This is a bit hard, and of course there are. This is not always true. But I can also see in Sweden, like in Kenya, this leads to certain passiveness and resignations, because it's really hard to continue all the time to try to advance your group or your activity when there's so much resistance from the top, so to speak. So maybe Swedish grassroots innovators and the transition movement should try to be more like the Latin Americans. Work a bit more with political mobilization and stronger in activism and more like legal challenges. We have seen that, I think, in the Netherlands, that people are actually starting to challenge legally different issues in society. And I also think that maybe we should also shift the focus from these innovators or the niches towards the regimes and try to understand if there are any niches inside the regimes, because in some municipalities, of course, you see that grassroots innovations are very well received. There are innovations taking place inside the municipalities. And I think that these are really important to change municipalities towards being more open to grassroots initiatives. I think maybe my time is up now, or yes. So I'll end with that. I think it's maybe a little bit a shift of focus and to look more into the municipality side of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Hendrik, for this very interesting international experience you bring into this panel. And I will quickly hand over to Gunilla before we have a short panel discussion with all panelists and David.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, David and Jan-Hendrik. First, I would like to say that to connect to what David said in the end, that many people now, we are so aware of that the change is inevitable, but that change doesn't need to be hardship and lead to depression. It can be even better than now, even better than today. And I think that optimistic imperative is what is guiding us. And I will just give a very short glimpse of the grassroots perspective, what we are doing here in the local municipality of Kungälv. It's a small peri-urban municipality close to urban city of Göteborg. And we are most of us we are all ordinary people, and what can we impact, what can we do at the very local level? So I will just mention 5 different issues that we are working on, and first we just mentioned them, and one of those issues is the food issues, also how to increase the local food production. I come back to that. Another issue is the energy situation. We are come back to that as well, and we are also working now how to establish a sustainability council where we have a dialogue and discussion, a discussion with the municipality government. We also have a seminar series for for the public on sustainability issues like climate, like food, travel, consumption, etc. And we also have a permanent column in the local newspaper on climate and sustainability issues. For the food issues, for increasing the local food production, it's a matter of decreasing our vulnerability in terms of being dependent on the global food systems with large shares of imported food. So we are working both with the food stores, and actually one of the food stores is very positive and very good at marketing local food. We are working with the local producer organizations where actually students from the environmental program in Gothenburg University have been involved. And we have a project also on how to increase the use of local semi-natural pastures, also naturbetesmark, and linking that to sustainable meat production, including both biodiversity of the pastures and animal welfare issues. And in fact, sustainable food system, it's sometimes it is like stated that that work on food systems, it can be like leverage point for the transition, just because of daily food intake. It has links to so many dimensions of the society, and that can give insights on the need for transition. And for just a very local example on that is that for a time here in Kungälv, we had only garlic imported from China to sale. And people got mad about that, and it made people really think, why is this? Why it is so? Garlic can be grown here, and we don't, and why is it so? And for the energy issue, we are doing some work with the local municipality energy company. And one issue is, for example, can our municipality be self-sufficient in producing electricity from renewable sources like wind and solar panels, for example? And can it be mandatory to install solar panels on the roofs for all new buildings? We're also trying to link this to university, to students. Yes, and I think I stop there and I wait for your questions. I would also like to say that there is an very large interest from many people in this, and I've been amazed that so many people that you might not expect to be reflecting on transition and change. People are really this is on the top of things for almost everybody today, and it is certainly related to the change we all are in now, not only the pandemic but also the environmental problems that have become so visible for everybody. So it is not a matter of that the change will come. We are in the mid of the change right now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gunilla and Jan-Henrik, for sharing your perspectives and reacting a little bit to some of the work that you've been engaged with, both locally and also internationally. I think we'd like to use the next 7 minutes to have some space for the three of you to interact and react to each other's perspectives. I think I'd leave it over to you first, David, as keynote, to do that. If you would like to bring up anything from your side, or if you'd like to react or pose questions to either Gunilla or Jan-Henrik, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, thank you for those perspectives. What Jan-Henrik brought up about working more with municipalities and perhaps looking to work more politically, both very interesting questions. I'll talk about the political action first. It's so difficult to focus on everything at once. And what we say about transition, that it's a for movement, it's for something. So what we're doing is looking to help people to imagine what's new. And then there are other against actions, which are also important, where we have, for example, Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion, where their primary focus is to say to legislators, stop. And that's absolutely vital. We must have that. But it's not enough on its own. You can't just say stop doing wrong things. We have to reimagine the future as well. And if we were well financed and better organized, with even more with a paid staff or more volunteers or something like that, then maybe we could take the political fight as well. And I agree, it needs to be done. Or I don't want to say fight. It's not nothing. Fighting is the analogy perhaps that's got us here. You know, we need collaboration and positive change. And I kind of agree that we need to work there as well. But we just don't have the legs for it at the moment, to be honest. Although there are other local movements that have come from local transition groups in Gävle, for example. Sorry, Söderhamn. If you speak Swedish, you can check that out. Ställ om Sverige. Political movements that have come from transition groups, where they see that local decision makers don't have the imagination, the possibility, the training, the understanding, perhaps the insights required to make those brave decisions which are required, because you don't get re-elected on transition policies at the moment. Looking to municipalities, yeah, I mean, obviously we want to scale up. We need to scale up, and the level of municipality and in Sweden, the region, is what we need to have in as well. So it's from the top on different local levels, responding to what's happening from the grassroots level. I think because politics is very much a response to what's happening, rather than a guiding or designing force. And of course, we're always trying to look to different groups and peoples around the world to take inspiration, so we can take the best of what there is and always move on, move forwards. We can't go backwards, but we can learn from history, which we need to do, and learn from other people, which we have the possibility to do with our modern technology. Gunilla mentioned loads of fantastic local projects, regenerative food production, energy, which is exactly the way we need to go. And it's in the doing of those things that trust is built in local groups, where people start we build up the trust which we've lost perhaps in this hyper individualized culture that we've developed for ourselves. Also interesting, at the end, Gunilla, you said that we're in the change. Change is happening whether we like it or not. Perhaps we want to see ourselves as change makers. How do you make change? And change is happening anyway. We need to look sort of this gradual change. If we'd done it 40 years ago when Limits to Growth came out originally, then perhaps gradual change would be enough. Now we need transformational change, or just something new. Lots of new things, lots of new ideas being tested all around the place. Tested, prototyped, developed, redeveloped, spread, changed again, based on what is required for the local situation. So being aware that we're in the middle of this, change is here. It's just unevenly spread.
Thanks so much, David. We have around 1 minute before I would like to open up the floor for the audience to engage with you also. I'm just wondering, Gunilla or Jan-Henrik, would you like to quickly mention anything, as long as we can keep it quite short so that we have enough time to really...
Yeah, yeah, I think this is a very important message, that there is so much negative things, but we have an opportunity now for a lot of new things, innovative things, and that is we have to really take that take that serious. That is our hope. That is our window right now.
Yes, and I agree with that, of course. And I didn't really want to put the blame on the transition movement for being passive. It's more like a national problem we have here in Sweden, maybe, that we are a bit like too relaxed, or maybe too dependent on authorities in general. So I think we need to work with ourselves a bit more.
Absolutely. And an interesting example is Russia, where there's very little, and many other countries as well, where there's very little trust in the state. And pretty much always has been. And there you see large kolchoser, the local communities that are very much, well, they grow for their own, they grow food for their own needs, as well as selling on the market, or as required by the state, back when that was. But yeah, absolutely. Trust in the state, trust in the system means that you do lean back. You trust in the state, and then that trust is not actually relevant. It's not deserved, really, because everyone's gotten into this kind of sleepy mode where they're just thinking we can continue as we always have done, whereas that's exactly what we can't do. And I don't mean to criticism.
I don't mean to cut you off, David, but just with that, would it be okay if we open up the floor to bring in some questions from the audience also? As I've mentioned, feel free to pose your question in the chat or to use the raise hand function. I also see that Marianne from Northern Ireland has posted in and started to share different initiatives that are happening. Hey, Marianne, different initiatives that are happening. Please feel free to do that also in the chat. It's great. It's great to do that. But I see that Francis Bray, you've raised your hand. Feel free to ask your first question. And also if it's directed at a particular speaker, of course, it would be great if you could clarify that too.
Well, thank you, Gavin. So Francis Bray from Chalmers. I have a question about scaling up. So I think we all agree that the challenge that we have in front of us is very large, and we don't have that much long of a time scale to address it either. And I know also that a lot of grassroots movements, there is kind of this, for some at least, this kind of double view of like scaling up, where part of it is for it to be small and local, and that kind of when you start scaling up, it loses part of its, core feature of it. And at the same time, we need maybe this larger scale and spread of it. So I'm just curious, probably mainly David, on your view of this, of scaling up, but of course, if Gunilla and Jan-Henrik have some views as well, they can chip in.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. We need to scale up, and I think that's kind of what maybe Jan-Henrik was getting at, and I think that's probably one of the keys, is to find a method, a model to engage municipalities. There is a project in the transition movement in Europe called Municipalities in Transition, where they're searching for this model in order to engage local decision makers in what's happening. Because while we're seeing it's easier to talk about transition in the light of Corona, we do need more help. It needs to come from all directions. So I think that the scaling up is probably on a municipal and regional level, and then the spreading of ideas from region to region, from country to country, really. And there are the networks in place, but it's a networked idea which is gaining traction, but it just needs to be opened up. One interesting thing that is happening as well is with warm data that Nora Bateson is working on, where she's aiming at, or we're aiming at, getting warm data into 10,000 local communities, and that could be something which really opens up conversations. Gunilla.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I would like. There is very much activities going on in the regions, and for example, in Västra Götalands regionen that contains 47 municipalities. There are plans for the food system. There are plans for the energy transfer. So not those plans are still relatively vague and vague, yeah. But the several of the municipalities will cooperate and in that way will work in a regional level. So I think scaling up from municipalities to region is a way to go.
Yes, I agree, but I think also the strength of the transition movement is that it's really super local, and that also means that it has quite a lot of traction with local municipalities, and I think that is also something that can be used more to upscale or replicate, or someone wrote outscale in the chat. Yeah, to keep that momentum from the local perspective.
Mm. Yeah. Just to expand a little bit on that, scale up indicates that you're doing the same thing but bigger, that one producer spreads it more. But it's the network thing that I was trying to get at, where it's more examples of the same or similar ideas, which is the interesting thing.
Perfect. Thanks for those insights. I also I see Ellen Palm on the side has her hand raised. I've also noticed, Ulf, your message in the chat, and also Sam, that you've raised your hand, but I'd maybe like to start with Ellen, if you would like to pose your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this has been a really interesting discussion. And I wonder about, kind of connected, I guess, to Francis' question on scaling up, but the discussion here is on local, on grassroots, and sort of on the cultural context. I really like that comment, David, of it's not about the houses and the energy system that they entail, but it's rather about the local culture. But how can that then be connected to other systems, larger system that also needs to transform? I work with the industrial systems. I work with plastics industry, but it might as well be the steel industry in Luleå or plastics and steel in Sund. So they are local in a sense, but they're of course governed by both national and global sort of industrial logics. Can this type of network thinking and local transition be applied to those, I guess, both local and global industrial systems that also need to transition? Or is it, as you say, with the forest industry, that it's simply need of legislation saying that we should not deforest?
Plastics and steel. That, I mean, they come about through the industrial growth economy, which you mentioned, and it's a question of, if we do have a low energy society, which we have to come to because there is no cheap oil left, and wind and solar just don't cut it, do we have the resources to keep those industries running? Do we have the need to keep those industries running? Or have we imagined local societies which have grown beyond, found other ways of doing those things which are being done? It depends on the on the time perspective as well. But I mean, if we're seeing as the Limits to Growth Revisited report suggests, a population and economic decline from 2030, ±5, perhaps, then where does any industry or economy, what is their place in that? My son watches football, and we're saying that there's been no fans in football arenas. Does the football industry have a future? I mean, how long can they continue when they're losing money, paying absurd wages to the players? What industries have a place in the future, which we really don't know what's going to happen? I don't know.
Could I jump in? Just an observation regarding the football industry. Walking the slums in Kenya, I mean, these leagues from the UK, they are really important. They're really having a local footprint there, and in some way. But anyhow, in Latin America, like Argentina and Brazil, we have seen how large corporations are actually starting to collaborate with these grassroots movements. So there are certain connections. Of course, they are still quite small, but there is a certain influence or interaction between them. So there is something there, but I cannot really say so much more about it than that.
Just a reflection on industries, and I'm thinking of the recent case we had here in Western Sweden of the Preem that will change their production now from based on fossils to based on renewable or something different, or maybe we don't know what the future will be, but some of the existing industries and activities will have to change because they are not based on renewable resources, and there is again a place for innovation. It doesn't mean that totally closed up of everything and people have to move from there, but there is a need for innovation, and that is also hopeful. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Thanks for the question, Ellen, and also from the responses from David, Gunilla, and Jan. Sam, I noticed that you had your hand raised and you were also raising it on the screen. So if you'd like to pose your question, I would say this would be the last question that we take. For those of you who have posed questions in the chat, we can also pass those on to David, Gunilla, and Jan. Maybe more as thought-provocative comments. And if you'd like to reach out to them and have a further conversation, please feel free to do that, of course. But in the interest of time, maybe we take one last one with Samuel.
Thanks. And yeah, really interesting discussion. And I guess it relates a bit to what was being said around how you do sort of scale up. But I was just interested on reflections, like, David, I liked your sort of analogy or characterization of organizations that are for something and against something. And, so you've got your kind of Extinction Rebellions, you've got your sort of grassroots transition movements, and then you've also got perhaps people working more, under the tent, perhaps, of policies and politics. And I guess I'm just interested on reflections on how you really get those different groups that may have quite divergent views on perhaps something like the role of plastics and steel in the future. Like, I don't think everyone across those groups is going to agree, but how do you, well, do we think we should still establish a kind of a broad church philosophy of people pulling together? And if so, how do we make that happen? Because certainly, for instance, in the UK, there have been interesting examples of, Extinction Rebellion, for instance, attacking the Committee on Climate Change, which is sort of, one of the key sort of policy operators for delivering advice to government. And I guess just interested in reflections on how you, if you should, and how you bring those different stakeholder groups together for a common cause.
Thank you. I think maybe you need to start with defining what the common cause is, which kind of relates back to Ellen's question. Is there a definition of something which is regenerative? I mean, if we say that what we need is to create regenerative cultures, regenerative societies. What's a regenerative industry?
But exactly, and I think this is my point of whether, because in order to bring that many diverse groups together, you probably need to land on something that brings people together, or do you actually think once you get down to that sort of debate, because essentially a lot of it comes down to politics as well, and your outlook on whether the world is fundamentally extractive kind of or not, I think. And yeah, I think, can you bring those groups together, and if so, how?
I mean, networking is one of the key things of transition and coming together around a cause. And there, it's so much easier to get people to come together when there's something positive to aim for. At the same time as the people who have invested time and money in things. So my career before I became a full-time transitioner, I was very invested in that. I was very, very invested in who I was personally, and giving up that kind of self-identification, giving up perhaps the monetary investment, giving up the time investment, or saying it, I thought I was doing the right thing, but it turns out that it wasn't the best thing for the planet, and doing something else instead. It's harder when you've invested more, and just hearing the message of you have to stop will perhaps not take effect. The message of here's something better may take effect, but it may not. So I mean, when I don't know that we're going to get everybody on board. There's going to be people who profit so enormously out of the way things are that they're not going to join us in what we're trying to do, and we just need to do what we want to do anyway, and realize that we can't convince everybody of the goodness of this cause.
Thank you very much. I have to finish everything now because we've reached already 1 o'clock. It was super interesting to hear about, I would say, the values that underlie the transition network and your work, but also what we heard from Kung Elf, from Gunilla, like the role of the local communities, what you're working on, what you're struggling with, and the international perspective and very critical perspective towards which role municipalities have or could have. I think what I personally take away is that every change also includes some extinctions, and we can look forward into a positive future, and we also have to accept that many things will change, and we don't know which industries will survive and which one will not. And I also started to ask myself, what will be our role? We are researchers, and we usually try to understand things in those boxes that David showed in his presentation, to make the world understandable and to have some sort of analysis. And yeah, I think those are questions that we don't have answers to, but let's keep the discussion going. Thank you, David, thank you, Jan-Henrik, thank you, Gunilla, thank you, Gavin, and thank you to all the audience for your questions and time, and I hope to see you at the next Transition Talk next year. Have a good winter vacation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.